Let's all remember to invite people to come to the site for the opening. If we collectively, we should all, somebody will remember.
We've got a slide for that.
I believe we started, it says live now.
Are we live? Well, good. That's the challenges of being in a virtual session. You can't see when everybody's milling in. So hopefully everybody is here. Certainly our panelists are here today, which is great. Good afternoon, everybody, and I appreciate everybody attending our session today on challenging interpretation, the state's response to tribal calls for action. Which might be a little bit of a misnomer because we are not simply a state. It is a response indeed, but indeed this is a collaboration. I'm Patrick Moore. I am the Executive Director of New Mexico Historic Sites and the Chair of the History and Heritage Division for the Department of Cultural Affairs in New Mexico. I'm joined today by a distinguished group of international partners, if you will, starting off, not sure which it looks like on your all screen, but you'll be able to see it. Manuelita Weaver, who is the director of the Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock. Holly Houghton, who's the tribal preservation officer with Mescalero Apache Tribe. Aaron Roth, the manager at the Bosque Redondo Memorial Fort Sumner Historic Site in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Morgan Young, who is a senior historian with Historical Research Associates, an entity that should not be lost on our NCPH colleagues, longtime supporter organization of our organization. And Eldon Potter with Brian Potter Design in beautiful Portland, Oregon. Today, our conversation really evolves around hundreds of years of planning coming to fruition and a complicated challenge. For myself, when I joined the Department of Cultural Affairs in 2016, I was faced with a number of complex challenges, if you will, looking at what needed to be done with a group of historic sites in a state which has incredibly diverse, complicated resources. And how do we bring these into the 21st century? Unquestionably, the most challenging of these was Bosque Redondo. This was a site, the American concentration camp story happened here. The death of thousands and thousands of people correlated both with what happened on the site and with the long walk and the forced relocation of both Mescalero and the Navajo people to this spot along the Pecos River Valley. And as I took this to say, they have no exhibit, you need to help figure out and lead the task to make it happen. That is a daunting, daunting task. My years as a university professor while I was in Florida and my years before that as an oral historian, as director of the Arizona Historical Society, my mantra and what I taught for years, you cannot tell another person's, another community, another group's story for them. Only they can tell that story. Tragically, a fail point that has happened far too often. And indeed, this was exactly what happened from the moment that this site opened to the public in 1968, all the way to the present. Starts, stops, fails, new starts, conversation. We'll create an exhibit. We'll get buy-in from the tribes who were there was a common refrain. And when I arrived, it was a collection of panels on the walls of this beautifully built museum that Aaron will talk to in a moment. That was basically the history of Bosque Redondo in print form stuck on a wall. The best non-exhibit exhibit I've ever seen, but still. And it really started with a collaboration. I know we are going to touch on this, but I think the critical piece about how do we go about doing something which has unquestionably challenged public historians since museums themselves came into go. How do we go about the process? And it was really about not the exhibit itself, but getting to know each other. We spent time together. We spent time at the site. Then we spent time down at Mescalero. Then we spent time up at Navajo Nation. We met with each other. We met with community members. We talked to each other. We engaged in conversations that often weren't even remotely about the exhibit itself. But this process of getting to know each other, a very slow process, was arguably the most critical part of this entire undertaking, and why we are all here today. This exhibit itself is incredible. It is powerful. It is compelling. It is unlike anything that I have had the privilege not just to work on, but probably ever to have visited. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to the manager at Bosque Redondo Memorial, who has been the boots on the ground, if you will, for many, many years now, Aaron Roth. Aaron.
Thank you, Patrick, for that warm introduction. And thank you again to all of our participants for joining us today. We really appreciate your interactions. And of course, if you have any questions, by all means, leave those in the chat box. We'll definitely be addressing those as time goes on. But I would like to take a pause just for a moment, just for those of you who are kind of coming into this conversation cold, just to talk about the history of this site and of this community, just to give you a frame of reference before we go too far down the rabbit hole. Fort Sumner, Bosque Redondo, the Indian reservation that was established here in 1862, as Patrick stated, this was, by its very definition, a concentration camp where people were gathered by and forcibly marched to by the hundreds and by the thousands. The first group of people that were marched here as a result of these poor interactions in the Southwest were the Mescalero Apache. Beginning in January of 1863, 500 people, marched to this area, that was very foreign to them, very different landscape, and told they were going to be farmers. Farmers, it's a very foreign topic, for somebody who's a traveler, and somebody who travels with the seasons. And then shortly thereafter, beginning in August of 1863, was when what is recognized as the Navajo Long Walk began. 53 different forced marches took place over those years, varying from 50 people marching at once up to 1,000 people marching at once. And the Scorched Earth campaign that was led against that group of people, left hundreds dead, not only from the roundups, but from the marches themselves. So 10,000 people set out, during this time, and maybe 9,000 people actually made it to Bosque Redondo. And then once those people got there, they had to build their captors' quarters. They had to create this farming community from nothing. And they were told that it was an oasis in the desert. But those farms failed year after year, and they had to rely heavily on rations. Rations were very poor to eat. When they were available, flour was topped off with plaster of Paris, according to the archival records and from oral histories from people who have survived. And then when there were shortages, people were forced to sell their bodies. Young children, ages 12 to 14, were forced to sell themselves for a pint of cornmeal to the soldiers in the tent city. So it was a very difficult existence, having, it wasn't just a removal from land, it was forced assimilation and genocide of a culture. But ultimately, Mescalero Apache did escape in November 3rd of 1865. They left Bosque Redondo never to return again. But they were on the run. They were forced to remain hiding. And they did so until 1873, when a formal reservation was established in their homelands. But then that left the Navajo communities. What was to be done with them? So a peace commission was brought to Fort Sumner. And ultimately, this process became a boilerplate for tribes all across the United States about how people were dealt with. And the people ultimately did return home, but there were some lasting repercussions from the treaty. I think about, Article 6, which was boarding schools. There were no stipulations or regulations as to how people were to be dealt with And again, that was another attempt at cultural genocide. So there are some lasting pieces of trauma that are still part of this history that, is all part of the conversation today. So the people did leave in 1868 and the reservation was shut down, but the people were told, do not look back upon this history, do not talk about it, always be looking forward. And that's what most people did. So now I'm going to fast forward a little bit. This is June of 1968, during the centennial of the signature of the treaty, which happened on June 1st, 1868. 3,000 people approximately gathered in this open field that formerly was Fort Sumner. And they reenacted the signature of the treaty, just recognizing this solemn moment when the people did return home. So there was this renewed momentum that there needs to be a space to talk about this history. So in that same month, in that same year, 50 acres were set aside by the city of Fort Sumner to establish Fort Sumner State Monument. So in 1970, this is when the visitor center was open to the public. 880 square foot museum to the right, and then to the left was a manager's quarters. But there really wasn't any discussion about what was to go into this space. It was just felt that this was to discuss the entire history of the area, not just the reservation era, but everything. So then we have this traveler shrine that was established in 1971. This was created by a group of Navajo medicine men through blessing way ceremony, and it's a place where people bring pieces of the homeland for those who did not return home, and it is still very much in use to this day. Then in 1974, a footprint was created of the original fort, built on top of the original foundation, and then this post flag, which you see there in the distance, were used as waypoints. Where am I was the common question that people had. So this gives people reference points. From the post flag, it was 20 miles in any direction that you looked that made up the boundaries of the reservation. But then the very first exhibition was installed in 1974, titled Fort Sumner, an American concentration camp. Now in 1974, we're coming off of World War II, and the visiting public did not appreciate being, lumped into Nazi Germany. So almost as soon as that exhibition was installed, it was pushed out the door. What was left in 1986 was the soldiers, the Indians, and Billy. That was the next exhibition and the longest running exhibition that was installed. And I can tell you the very first panel that greeted people when they walked in said, the newcomers to the West were met with the same ferocity, from the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache that plagued the Spanish years prior. So the people that were intending to serve with this exhibition were referred to as a plague. So the result was, on June 27th, 1990, this group of Navajo students who were part of the Save the Children organization came through the area, saw this exhibition, and were just appalled by what they saw. And they all signed this letter and left it at the prayer shrine. And they demanded that the truth be told and that they were a concerned generation for the future. So this is all coming from the youth right around high school age. So this really started a conversation that there needed to be a space specifically to talk about the reservation era of history. So that's when we're fast forwarding now to 2005, after several legislative sessions, and this letter was actually brought before the New Mexico State Legislature, that there needed to be this space, and they agreed. So funding was set aside to create the Bosque Redondo Memorial. So additional land was added, and in 2005, during the dedication, Governor Bill Richardson said, we don't have an exhibition, but it will be finished in my time. But that was never to pass. Now, there were several exhibitions that were created, but a lot of it was done, in closed doors. Conversations were had, but from the state's perspective of, we need this information, we go talk to the experts, and then we move on. So it wasn't really a two-way street. It was just side conversations that ultimately led to different designs that came to pass. Now, there were these panels. The information wasn't incorrect, but it was like reading a book on the wall, as Patrick stated. Now, in 2014, again, the youth coming forward, the Mescalero Apache Tribe Sovereign Nation Service Corps created this prayer circle in honor of the 9 individuals who remained on the reservation so that those others could escape. Now, this is the final exhibition plan. Again, there were some good elements, some that we have kept, which we will talk about shortly, but a lot of this was very offensive still. Use of dioramas to describe tribal homelands, basically putting people in a time capsule as if they no longer exist. Use of animatronic mannequins to represent tribal head figures. And just the overall exhibition did not have enough clout. So in 2015, we came to a crossroads. We had this exhibit funding. We had this exhibition plan. Do we move forward with it, or do we start over? The ultimate plan was to start over and to restart the conversation, because we could not move forward with this given that the people did not agree to this. They were not part of the conversation. We had to start over. So in 2016, we developed this interpretive planning committee. And through government to government relationships, we asked heads of government to select their own representation to sit at the table with us to discuss first the interpretive plan, which basically acts as a filter to only things that are reflective of this community's wants and needs goes into this space. So the very first conversation that actually happened was at Bosque Redondo Memorial. And that really set the stage as to how serious this situation was, that for many people, this was their first visit to Bosque Redondo. So for them to willingly come to this space, it was a very serious situation. But it did start a conversation. And for the first 6 months of this interpretive plan, we were just having a discussion, talking about what our values are, learning how to have a conversation again, because so much trust over those years had been lost or broken. And actually, many parts of the conversation took place at Navajo Nation and Mescalero. They felt it was necessary, our partners felt it was necessary that we visit these homelands. And if you haven't done so, you should do so as well. But we had to have accountability. We had to visit the people, hear their stories, hear who they are, and have accountability that if we mess up, this is who we are affecting. So there had to be some accountability. But this is really where things started to take off. So it took about 1.5 years just to develop the interpretive plan. And once the interpretive plan was in place in early 2017, then a bigger conversation was happening. And thanks to HRA kind of leading that conversation, everything stayed in focus. But now that the interpretive plan was established, this same group of people who were having and leading this conversation felt it was time now to start talking about how do these elements that we've talked about for so long come to life in a space that is literally a blank canvas. So I'd like to step back. I'm going to end my share, and Morgen Young is going to take over this conversation and also leave room for our partners.
Thanks, Aaron. So we're going to pick up exactly where Aaron left off. And just to go back to the site visits. So when we went to Mescalero and we went to Window Rock, and I wanted Holly and Manny to share why those visits were so important for informing the interpretive planning process, as well as the permanent exhibit that we'll elaborate on. So Holly and Manny, can y'all just kind of tell us what we did during those site visits, why they were important? What were some of the issues that we were trying to communicate?
I guess I'll go first. One thing that I felt was a little bit important too is we involved some of the youth of the tribe as well. They traveled up to Navajo Nation and got to see that community and to give some of their input as well. But we felt it was, very good for the people to understand our communities and the businesses within our communities, and to have an idea of the landscape, to see why going to that reservation was such a different world compared to the lands that we, luckily the Navajo and the Mescalero, their reservations were eventually established in their homelands. So we are back in the lands that they're originally taken from. And then it just allowed a lot of time and conversation as people became aware of the art and the cultures too, to discuss different things that, may allow better interpretation to the general public. Manny, do you want to pick up now or?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hey, I'm Manny Lito Wheeler. Everybody called me Manny. Just to, I guess, address the specific point of having these groups, which primarily consisted of non-native people, to have them come into our homelands and, show them around, that there were a lot of points to be made for that. It was not necessarily the point of, it relates directly to the history of Fort Sumner, Bosque Redondo, but everything kind of relates to that now for Navajo people, but for many Navajo people, it was to get this group who was about to tell a very important part of Navajo history, of Mescalero history, and of American history. It was to get them to understand and have an amount of respect going into this project about who they were about to represent. So, I think as a human being, if you're raised with that level of respect, when you go to somebody else's home, you have that respect, and you give them that respect because you're a guest. And so for them to come here and look at our schools, look at how our community operates, look at the economic status, or not status, but look at the economics of the Navajo Nation, look at different programs within the Navajo Nation, federal programs, tribal programs, private programs, just to really give them a true glimpse of what Navajo life is. That was really important to me, and I really pushed for that. And there were points of that trip where scholars were kind of becoming scholars, and they were just focused on scholarship and not on the bigger picture of who we are and what we're about and where we want to go. And I think that really caught some of them off guard, and I was put in positions where I had to remind them, about where they were and what type of message they were talking about. So just again, I think to put these type of groups in not situations, but to put them in environments where they're forced to ask themselves, questions before they start telling the story. And I've been in a lot of museums and involved in a lot of exhibits. And, you know, yeah, you all out there listening, you're involved in public history. And, you know, there are many times when, you know, you're just going off of research and it's scholarship and research is very important. I'm not saying it's not important, but sometimes you're in a position where you can't see the forest for the trees. And so this was a point of letting everybody see the forest. So, you know, that's all I'll say for now. And I'm sure we'll have questions throughout this presentation, and I'm happy to answer them the best I can. Thank you.
Thank you both. So after the site visits, we had a visit, just a little bit of context. HRA was brought on as a subcontractor to the state to help with develop the interpretive plan, and then from that the exhibit. And we subcontracted Brian Potter Design. This is Eldon Potter, one of the owners, sitting here with me. We're both in Portland, Oregon. And we were able to go with the Potters to the site. And so here are early site visits. And I wanted again to hear from Holly and Manny about what Bosque Redondo means to the Mescalero and to the Navajo, and to be at that site, because this is one of the galleries and you can see through the window the actual landscape as it looks now.
And I would also, kind of as part of that question, you know, we went down there kind of knowing very little about both the story and the site as designers, but I will say that that meeting that we had in this big empty museum was an unusual chance to kind of start something without a lot of preconceived notions. And I think that's where we were really in listening mode, kind of to Morgan's question, you know, what does this site mean to Mescalero and Diné people?
One thing within the culture, that time period wasn't really discussed a lot of the time. It's part of the culture not to speak about those that we've lost or bad events that occurred. And so it was something that was not brought up, because in a cultural way that can bring things back. And it was a tragic time for the Mescalero and the Navajo people. But it came to the recognition of a lot of the tribal members that, you know, we do need to tell this story, this past, to the general public, so that they can learn from this tragic period, this time, and hopefully not ever repeat it again. So, you know, the Mescalero decided they did need to start talking about it to relate things they had heard about that time period, and that we needed to reach out more about it, so that, as we said, people would understand. You know, initially, the Park Service had done a study to try to designate the Long Walk as a National Historic Trail. And after several years of working on that research and compiling it, it was determined not to designate that trail, because the tribes did not feel that at that time it was appropriate to discuss the suffering of that situation. But as I said, through time, we decided that it would be in a beneficial manner, in sense the state was willing to work with the tribes to interpret it more from their viewpoint, that it was time to open up and to provide this interpretation and work on it together. You know, most times when we're given consultation things on exhibits and designs, it's already been determined. And as you saw from what Aaron had showed, they originally had a plan all devised out for the interpretation of the visitor center without really asking the tribes ahead of time if they thought this would be a good exhibit to put together, or how do you want this interpreted? And in most cases, that is how the consultation occurs. So we're very thankful that the state did step back and actually listen to how the tribes would like to have the story told and interpreted, and what different areas to focus on, and to try to provide an understanding and an outreach to the visitor of the culture and the torment, and also the strength and the continuity of the culture and the survival and the strength of the communities that they are today.
Thanks, Holly. So, you know, for the Navajo people too, is very sensitive, and still is a sensitive point in history. There are many cultural implications associated with Fort Sumner. And by that, I mean whether or not to travel to it or not. And, you know, there are definitely large factions within Navajo that are both for going to Fort Sumner and against going to Fort Sumner. So, you know, knowing that, for me, going into and participating with this project, you know, I already knew it, you know, this was a really delicate point of history for Navajos. And, you know, so I really approached it with extreme caution and respect. And, you know, I had to make the best decisions for Navajo people. You know, I was kind of going in as that representative. So as I mentioned before, you know, I have a lot of background in developing exhibits. So, you know, I knew from watching other exhibits develop, when there's very little exhibits about Native people, when there's very little input from Native people, or no input from Native people, or the Native consultants that are chosen, and this is something I see a lot throughout the country, is you know, there's a lot of cherry picking, so to say, going on, where they get almost the same individuals from within Native communities, and it's this group of people that museums and those other types of high profile groups wanting Native input that they go to. So I mean, so I knew that, and so anytime I would give my feelings or my thoughts on this when we're going through it, you know, I would always clarify that, you know, this is the angle I'm coming from, and I'm doing my best to represent Navajo people, but there are going to be other Navajo people that might not agree. So, you know, it was kind of like I said, it was just a sensitive project from day one. But, you know, I'm sure as we move on through this presentation, you know, I'm really pleased with how it came out, the exhibit, and it's really powerful, and it's very and it's a strong emotional visit for those of you that can make it out and take a look. But I could talk all day just about that, this particular topic about Fort Sumner and what it means to Navajo people. But I guess just know that it's a very complicated matter. It's one that I approach with respect. Navajo people are over 300,000. There's even talk about the new census that Navajo people are approaching 400,000 members. And so, that's what I mean. It's like, how am I supposed to give an answer for all of that large group of people? I can't, but I do my best to represent us the best I can. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly and Manny. We have a handful, half a dozen slides that show what the exhibit looks like now, and I hope that folks get a chance to visit Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and see this in person. But I was just going to explain, and Eldon will speak to, I'm sure, from a curatorial and design standpoint, and then turn back to Holly to talk about Mescalero input in the content and design, and then to Manny for the Navajo. But this is, so if you saw, this is what we had, blank walls, about 6,500 square feet, was already designed. The building was built, there were walls put in, but they were blank. So we had an empty canvas. And now this is the beginning of the exhibit. And that letter that Aaron mentioned that were from the 20 Navajo students, the original is just put right here. And so the story is not exactly told chronologically. It's also an exhibit that will never be done. The hope is that it will constantly be updated. But to break down some of the content and design elements, at HRA, we develop exhibits in layers because we think about the different types of visitors, the browsers, skimmers, and gorgers that come through things. So in each story area, we had big quotes, and we really balanced community voices and curatorial voices. So community voices come directly from oral histories that were recorded with Navajo and Mescalero. Big headlines, summary sentences that are presented in Diné and Ndé, Mescalero and Diné, Navajo, and English. And then the community voice, which is in a larger font, that comes first. And the community voice really tells the hard truths about what happened there. And then the curatorial content, which was developed by our team. And that just is meant to provide additional context. It never contradicts the community voice. This exhibit had a tremendous resource with a series of photographs that were taken between 1864 and 1868 at the site. And so we did large images of those. And the title of the show, Bosque Redondo, A Place of Suffering, A Place of Survival. A place of suffering is a translation from the word huelde, which is the Diné word for Bosque Redondo. But you can see in the background of this that we had digital content. This is a projected map that changes. So we just kept thinking about layers of content to go into this show. I don't know if you wanted to talk at all about design.
I guess one thing that I would highlight, even in this little kind of beginning slide, is that our exhibit objects were not charismatic. They weren't big, exciting pieces. They were very humble. And to me, that's part of the story too, was how to kind of tell the story through very simple kind of objects. And I know one of the issues we worked on a lot is kind of getting people to relate to kind of the basicness of the issues, survival and hunger, being away from home, all these pieces. So there's, I love that the first object you see is this note written on 2 pieces of notebook paper from 30 years ago. And it's just kind of presented as it was. It was left on site. Someone could have easily picked it up and tossed it, but instead it kind of kicked off this whole process to tell the story here. And I really like including those kind of objects. We have a cup of corn kind of related to
what Aaron was talking about.
Yeah, Aaron was talking about the cornmeal story that's part of the oral history of this site. The other thing I wanted to highlight was language. And I think we really wanted to come at this site story as a multicultural story, kind of an international story. The Spanish and English language that was kind of primarily used by the colonizers, but then the sovereign nations themselves. So throughout the entire show, everything's translated into, it's trilingual. So all our kind of key ideas are presented in Mescalero, Navajo, and English. And big props to Holly and Manny for pulling, helping us with that and really providing a huge cultural resource. And then we took that even into the center theater. We might hear a little bit if we've got time. We had audio recordings from the community. So we both did printed language, but then also audio recordings of spoken. So I'm really proud of the trilingual layer. And I feel like it really kind of created the presented the complexity of this site. And I hope that the viewers kind of get that sense of a multicultural world where things were coming together. This wasn't a conquering situation. This was like worlds that met and overlapped for tragic consequences, but for real. So that just kind of design-wise a great way where content and design got to go together for effect.
So if imagine you're in the same gallery where the intro is, and if you just turn, then you can see this is our Mescalero gallery, and we used Ndé for Mescalero throughout. We used the indigenous word, and Diné for Navajo. But I was hoping that Holly could speak to this, particularly Holly, the issue that we had with this image in this 2018 was we did a bit of a preview of the design concepts we were thinking for the 150th commemoration of the signing of the Navajo Treaty at the site. And so this is the same angle, 2017 and 2022. But Holly, could you elaborate on Mescalero involvement as we worked so closely together over these past 5 years in developing the exhibit?
I don't know where to start. As I said, it was very useful to all of us to work together and to get to go out to experience each other's culture and that. And, if you look at these different pictures, you see it's a very light, bright kind of exhibit, how it was originally designed, but to the final one, it is much more subdued, where it feels comfy, but you can also feel a little bit of the struggle and suffering just by the overall ambiance that it presents out with the lighting. And I think as you guys proceed a bit further, you'll go into a little bit more of that. And it just allowed a lot more feedback. I know we realized a few things were previously misinterpreted as we went through looking at some of the photos in that, based on the different type of just clothing alone, you could tell. There was I'm sorry if I can't recall if it was this one or another one, but there was one image where the person wasn't even, I think it was actually another one, but they were cited as being Mescalero, but they weren't even an Athabascan person. It was a totally different culture. But so there is a lot of, through the documented history, it's not recorded right at all a lot of times. So it does help to get some feedback and to have many different people looking at the same images and historic records. One instance as well that I can recall on a battle site that my office had worked on, according to the soldier's story, they went into this canyon where there was a Mescalero encampment and, attacked them, and they all took off and ran. But due to the archaeology that we did at the site, we found the bullets from the different guns where the people actually, the Mescalero had come back around behind the military and attacked them from the rear. but they didn't want to write that history. They wanted to tell their version of the story. And so again, that's another reason why it's very important to speak to all the players, to hear the different interpretations and just different reactions to that and results of that history. Manny, if you have some.
Manny, I'm going to switch to the Diné gallery so that we are showing as many images as we can. But if you wanted to speak to working on content and design.
I mean, that's a broad topic, but I mean, obviously you can see the before and after. And then another thing that Aaron Roth, who's the site manager, touched on earlier was that, you know, the earlier, prior to Aaron's arrival there, you know, they had reached out to me, and I was the director, a new director here at the Navajo Nation Museum, and the director there wanted, you know, wanted my input to this exhibit they were working on, but it was like it was already done. The exhibit was already done, and he was asking me. He was basically, in my opinion, he was asking me to rubber stamp it, you know. But I mean, I was new in this position here, but I had done plenty of exhibits, so I had the experience to comment on it. But you know, just that the approach wasn't I wasn't feeling it, and a lot of the things that were in that exhibit design were just kind of, again, you know, I wasn't feeling it. I wasn't like, oh man, you know, like I wasn't engaged. And because I wasn't engaged, I just kind of just put this stuff to the wayside. And it was really, you know, it was like pioneer. We really focused on pioneer living rather than any thing that really related to Navajo people and the long walk. And, you know, to be fair, I mean, this was so long ago, and I really don't remember everything that was in that that set of papers that he had mailed me, and then cold called me and asked me to comment on. So, but just that, all of those actions, you know, the point I'm trying to make is comparing that to this experience that we started on many years ago, like how many years ago now? But, you know, like being involved in this project, you know, I was engaged, and I was giving a lot of really solid information and solid feedback to make sure from as a Navajo representative that that it was going to be really good stuff. And again, as you can just look at the pictures, you know, this is some really interesting and emotional and factual points, a lot of factual points in history that were not told in the past. And part of that, you know, it has to speak to the times, you know, this exhibit or this museum was born in the, I think, in the 60s, and then the 70s and 80s until where we're at now. And as America matures, I think its sense of responsibility to history matures, you know. But, you know, that being said, there's some really interesting and scary points about history that are currently going on and being debated about right now. But, you know, I don't think, like Aaron said, you know, they tried to talk about it in the 70s about America, the long walks, and it referring to it as a concentration camp, which absolutely was. And then, you know, the environment, the social environment was not agreeable to it, and so they took it right down. And so here we come back again now in 2022, and reality, this exhibit would have been done in 2019, 2020, but then the pandemic hit. But you know, it's like, again, in my observation, I just kind of think America's kind of maturing with its understanding of its own history. So there's some really powerful and really tragic stories that are part of this exhibit from the Navajo side and the Mescalero side. So I guess that's all I'll have to say for now. Thank you.
Manny and Holly. And I wanted to point out too, so Eldon mentioned that we didn't have a ton of material culture to work with for this exhibit. Before, you can see in the 2017, previous efforts mainly focused on objects for object's sake. From my perspective as a historian, they had baskets and pottery that were from these communities, but not tied to this site specifically. And we do have fantastic objects for these first two galleries. Going back to the Mescalero gallery, it's hard to see in this photo, but we have basketry. And so we have a 19th century water jug, and then Holly worked with the community and we had a new jingle basket made to talk about the continuation of cultures. Too many times in exhibits, Indigenous communities are only discussed in the past tense, and we wanted it to be very clear that these are vibrant communities that never went anywhere. And then in the Diné gallery, we have a blanket that's on loan from Manny's museum that was likely made at Fort Sumner, Bosque Redondo, in the 1860s. And then there's a dress underneath that the wool is from the churro sheep that are raised at Bosque Redondo, and it was made by, and Aaron, you're going to have to step in and say something about the Eagle Scout that made this, that worked with a weaver to make this dress.
Yes. So in 2015, I met this young man. He was kind of rediscovering his history as he himself was Diné, but he was adopted by an Anglo family. So he was just kind of rediscovering his own personal history. And he was a Boy Scout, and he was working on his Eagle Scout project. And he said, in learning my own history, I want to do something for this memorial. So something to commemorate my people. So after a lot of discussions, I was settling on sheep and, weaving, and how that assisted with the survival of the people. And so we were going to create this panel together for the sheep exhibition outside, because we have a flock of our own that we donate a portion every year back to Navajo Nation to families who want to grow their own flocks. So this was just kind of the history piece. But he said, I'm going to take it a step further. So he raised $3,500 to have this dress commissioned by a well-known Diné weaver by the name of Zephyrin Anderson. And so we collected all of this wool from our sheep, and Zephyrin spent well over a year creating this woven dress in the same style that would have been worn in the 1840s through the 1860s. And, it's all naturally dyed. And so again, just kind of continuing with what Morgen is saying, something representative of what was, and then something representative of what is continuing today.
Thank you, Aaron. So we're going to keep going, and we're going to zip through some of these so we have time for questions at the end. But this is what we've called the long walk hallway. And so if you saw the photos of us on site during early visits, this is one of the design elements that we kept from previous iterations of the exhibit. And Aaron can talk more about these, but they were two original paintings, one by a Navajo artist, Chantal Begay, and one by Mike Scoville, a white artist. And we kept them, we just painted the ceiling above. And then one aspect of the exhibit is we have this light installation. And do you want to talk about it? Or do you want me to?
Oh, there was a lot of kind of how to present this idea of 10,000 people, kind of roughly the number that were gathered at Bosque Redondo. And we thought about all kinds of ways to kind of show that accumulation and create an impact out of that number. And in the end, we used fiber optic that, if you can see in the lower left there, it kind of snakes through the galleries, both from the start of the show to this center theater where things really shift in the story. But the thing we were really excited about was, in the end, there is some electric light here, but we also put access into the ceiling. We actually pull sunlight in and send it through the fiber optics. So thank you, Patrick, for funding that complexity. But it really was a way to kind of try to memorialize and depict, I guess, some sense of the number of people that were imprisoned here. And I feel like pulling that sunlight in, having that connection to the outside world and to the area around to the land, was really an important part of this extra kind of interpretive feature. I don't know if anyone wants to throw in, but we were really pleased with how it turned out. So when you go through the exhibit, look up.
Yeah, and there are 500, I believe, yellow.
Yeah,
Right.
we did some color coding to kind of get the two groups
To
some
represent,
differentiation, right?
500 Mescalero, about 9,500 Navajo.
Navajo, yeah.
And this as well. And what we heard from Holly and Manny is, like, when we started conceptualizing this, is it needs to be subtle. It can't be neon lights that are overhead.
Yeah.
But I'm going to keep us moving along because I'm going to be the time monitor for us. So the next part that just want to show, and hopefully I've shared my settings correctly, is that this is a theater room. So if you saw in the previous, this is the floor plan of the entire 6,500 exhibit space divided into different galleries. This round room is the peak of your emotional experience. So we were plotting out emotions when we were, as a group, developing content and design. You get to the round room, and that's the height of it. And we have,
It's also life at Bosque.
right, it's what actually happened at the site. And we can talk about this during Q&A. These very subtle objects, very kind of innocuous objects, and an experience about 12 minutes that's done in 3 languages, Diné, Ndé, and English. And these are all from oral histories. And hopefully, and my team, because you're the only videos I can see, you have to give me a thumbs up that you can hear this. You can hear this excerpt.
Navahaki, dort I see the Navajo Nation, where the hot idigi. The neto son lenigi, the Navajo Nation, ito at the hot idie. Only his ani don has twi, yen kilta had ne et ea, bam the wheat nexe. There is nobody around who knows the true story of the Navajos' long walk. No man or woman knows exactly what took place during that time. We just repeat as closely as we can remember what our ancestors told us. Florence Charlie, Diné.
And there's projected video through all this that kind of floats and moves really slowly through this space. And it was a way to really tell the story in another level. There's no panels, there's no kind of big interpretive statements, but it's really focused on the voices. And then there's a little bit of interpretive program with the music and sound design. So props to Brent Ashbury here in Portland for putting that together. But again, I think the key here is that community resource of those recordings. And it was during COVID, y'all. So Manny, I don't know how you got in and out of that studio with those high quality recordings, but both Manny and Holly tracked down native speakers and really got fantastic resource to create this audio program to tell these stories. So,
which were based on translations that Holly and Manny facilitated.
Yeah.
So throughout, I don't know if other folks want to comment on this or if we want to move to the escape and treaty gallery. I'm going to leave us about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A.
all right.
No one says anything, then I'm moving on. Oh. So then this is, so early on in the process, Manny called these our rock star stories, that there are powerful events that happened. And so there was the escape of the Mescalero in 1865, and there was the signing of the Navajo Treaty in 1868. And so you come out of the height of your emotional experience in this round room, and now you have these positive, more positive stories with the Mescalero escape and the treaty. In 2018, for the commemoration, 150th commemoration of the treaty, we had a copy of the treaty there. And Manny or Aaron, you could speak to that, but I wanted to just mention that this was where we were able to do one gallery entirely with our design concepts and get some helpful community feedback. And one thing that we got, this is Manuelito, a leader, and we had this big photograph of him, and several community members from the Navajo Nation said, "You're not recognizing women and their role in the treaty negotiations. Women were critical." And so we changed that design to Juanita, a leader within the community. Also in this room is an interactive of the treaty, with each page a high resolution scan, and the treaty is read in Navajo. So this is just, it's a super powerful, all the rooms are powerful, but super powerful content that comes about in this room. And I'm going to turn it over to other folks to share what they want.
Yeah, the treaty was a major focal point, especially in this particular space, because during that 2018 show, that kind of mock-up, we actually had one of the original copies of the Treaty of 1868. It was found in a travel trunk belonging to one of the former peace commissioners, and the great-great-grandniece of this peace commissioner, who was living in his home, decided to give it to the site to use for the entire year to educate people and use it for display. And simultaneously, Navajo Nation had the Washington copy of the Treaty of 1868. So let me just kind of frame things. There were 3 copies that were signed on June 1st, 1868. There was what was referred to as the Washington copy. Then there was one that was given to Navajo Nation. Then there was this third that was kind of like the bureaucratic copy. And that's what traveled with one of the peace commissioners that we had in our possession at that point. And so simultaneously, we were promoting each other during the 150th.
We mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that this is an exhibit that will never end, and this is one way. This is the reflection room, and it has modern stories, 21st century stories. So here we talk about the Tappan copy of the treaty that Aaron just mentioned, and people are able either physically, they can write with chalk pens on these questions that have been asked throughout the exhibit space. They can write on Post-it notes, and then they can type in here and it projects overhead. But I mean, Aaron occasionally sends us updates, and it's just super powerful. People are coming from really around the world to this small town in rural New Mexico. People who have direct family connections to the site, and people who are just interested in history. So Manny and Holly, how do you think that the exhibit kind of keeps living on? I mean, our goal in developing this as a group was for never it to be frozen in amber on the wall for 20 years, but for it to keep living. So can you expand on that?
Well, to me, to have people to be able to write their reflections or their viewpoint of the exhibit or comments, you know, that in itself gives us some guidance on maybe what we should focus on a little more or change or add. But it allows for the visitors after the previous bunch to see their interpretation a little bit as well. So that's one way it's always changing. Also, just right after the reflection room, there's like a little resting area with some furniture to sit down and for people to either discuss things, or there's some reading material there. But one thing that the tribal nations had asked for also was a place for them to have the decompression. Many times, you know, when being at an area of where bad events happened or just being exposed to some of that things, you need to have a cleansing to be done afterwards. And so we had with the Potters and Morgen and that gone through a couple different ideas. Eventually we did decide to have one outdoors because most time native cleansing will involve burning some sage or different things, and we didn't want to set off any fire alarms. So and also a lot of times it does need to be private. It's not something that you want viewed by others. So we eventually came up. So there is for people who just need to sit back and decompress, but also if you need to go and have an official type cleansing just outside that area, you can go and do that as well. So again, it was incorporating the concerns of the tribal people who are going to this exhibit as well. But there's also a little recording area, like a tablet that people can record little stories on as well if they feel so and open to do something such as that. And so that again can allow for comments and content that can help to expand as we go forward.
I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm just going to go through these last couple of more announcement style, but there is a grand opening for the exhibit, and it will be this month, which is really hard to believe, May 28th over Memorial Weekend. It's open to the public. So if anyone is in the vicinity of Bosque Redondo, Fort Sumner Historic Site, I hope that they come. And if you live elsewhere, there is a virtual tour of the exhibit. And this was an intern did this. So you're able to go and 3D images of all of the exhibit space. The hope is that you'll come visit in person one day. And then Aaron, can you speak to this and then we'll turn it over to questions?
Absolutely. So part of programming all throughout this time was sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And one of the projects that we undertook was the creation of this support website. Again, you know, just what are ways that we can continue having these conversations? So what this website does, if you're new to this history, it gives you an opportunity to view that history straight from the exhibition. It's using like content directly from our exhibition. So it's very much repeating the same story, the same content. But then you can dig a little bit deeper if you want to. If you wanted to know the sources that we looked at, you can go into the archives. You can help transcribe documents. We have an online archive of over 13,000 documents, and this is crowdsourced, by the general public. So you can actually unlock new aspects, new angles of history. But in addition to that, people from tribal communities can also contribute oral history as well, again, to the better telling of this history. So you can actually contribute, whether you're talking about video or, Morgan, you can go to the next slide, video or documented, handwritten, any which format is acceptable. Now, all of this content is reviewed. We have a board of, that oversees all the content. So this was created again with the same group of core members and went under their review. And they are also honorary administrators. So when oral history is submitted, it is reviewed by this committee.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can all see each other. And I'll facilitate the Q&A, and then folks can respond. But and someone asked if we can drop the links to the what we're talking about, and I will do that. Okay. So Manny suggested that during the planning process, visiting non-native scholars were offensive with their questions to the Navajo and missed the bigger picture. Can you give a specific example to illustrate your point?
Not going to name any names, but I think the group remembers, and it wasn't so much at all that this person was being overtly offensive, but sometimes in terms of this specific example, here's a person who's a history scholar, and this person was coming in telling us our history, and he was telling young people our history, and they were trying to just voice their thoughts, and this person was coming in and correcting their what their thoughts were. And the context of it was, it was like a lot of correcting of these young people. And at that point, is when somebody needs to be reminded about where they're at. And that's what I did, and I did it in a respectful way, reminded this person whose home they were in. And it's like that would happen anywhere, regardless. What if it was a person going into, I don't know, some small town in Kentucky and telling them who they were and what they really were about, or not really were about, what they had read in all of these books, but they never really experienced the people that they're talking about in such a factual tone, and so there's a lot of reading between the lines that goes on with stuff like this. And, you know, I, for one, and I think there's a lot of people out there, regardless of their cultural affiliation, you know, I'm just kind of at the point where, and I'm at the age where I'm, you know, I just kind of say what's on my mind, but again, in a respectful way, as I think the group will vouch for. You know, I don't want to say I don't hold back. I hold back, but I think not as much, and I think has a lot to do with my age. But anyways, that's an example as general as I can get it. I hope it answered your question. Again, I'm not going to out anybody. So thanks for the question.
And kind of mirroring that, Manny, down in Mescalero too, we had a moment like that when we were at the senior center. And I think that was really one of our first interactions directly with the community. And I felt like a lot of questions were just being asked just for the sake of asking or for information. And I remember the conversation afterwards was, you know, it might be better just to sit back and let the people talk. So I remember that experience as well. So again, just kind of laying the scholarship aside and just actually having a conversation, I think was tough for a lot of people.
I have a question for, oh, sorry, Manny.
I just want to clarify, and I know Aaron doesn't mean this, but you know, I just want to be clear that I'm not preventing scholarship, you know, but I am promoting respect. So that's, you know, that's where I'm coming from.
Absolutely.
You know, I'm not saying throw scholarship out the window, but you know, I'm just promoting a mutual respect.
Question for Patrick. Are you ready? Dr. Moore?
You bet, go.
Who are the financial backers of this memorial? And does it have sustainable funding?
So that's an excellent question that we have to deal with. The financial backers are the people of the state of New Mexico. This is one of New Mexico historic sites, 8 operational historic sites that we interpret to the public. And it's a critical part of preserving, protecting, sharing, communicating the history of this state. So it was by no small stretch when we kicked off this process in 2016, it was going to be a lift to make it happen. There were a number of challenges, but we did come through with the support of our current cabinet secretary and the governor's office about how do we bring this to fruition. And I know there was a quick acknowledgement there of thanks for paying for the light thing. That was actually a conversation that had to go all the way up because we have a lot of very important needs. So we will continue to fund it and support it. We also have opportunities for external support in this through the Museum of New Mexico Foundation. So if anybody out there is interested in supporting this incredibly important piece of history, we can work with it that way. But this is legislatively mandated and part of our charge through the Department of Cultural Affairs, and we will continue to operate this site going into the future.
Thank you for that. And what is taught about Fort Sumner Historical Site now? Which I'm going to give to Aaron, if he'll take it.
Okay. I guess I'm not sure in what context. You know, in schools in New Mexico, you know, a lot of people who went to school in Fort Sumner say that they never heard about Bosque Redondo or what Fort Sumner was. You know, there were only like whispers about Billy the Kid and, you know, the different characters that came about as a result of Fort Sumner. But today there is more of an active relationship with the school here locally, that we can actually be present in their classrooms, whether in person or virtually, or that they can actually come to the site to experience this history for themselves. And, you know, around New Mexico, we also have that program, which is Ranger on Call, that our staff can be invited to a classroom to speak or to share information about this history. So it's being presented with the same voice as the exhibition. So there's not any kind of contradiction taking place.
Thank you, Aaron. I have a question now that I think will mainly be for Manny, but I'm going to answer just a part of it. And the question is, the Treaty of 1868 seems a central component of the exhibit. The federal government broke many promises it made in treaties. Was that the case with this treaty? If so, how is that represented in the exhibit? In this presentation, we didn't show you all components of the overall exhibit. We showed you some of them. We want you to go to the site. One room we didn't touch on is what we call the after Bosque gallery. And that elaborates on some components, the impact of this site in federal Indian policy, and boarding schools, which was a large consequence of the Navajo Treaty, and you know, the trauma that comes with those boarding school experiences. But Manny, what do you think about whether the government honored this treaty in the 150 plus years since it was signed?
I think depending on what lawyer you ask, you will get different answers. So yeah, I think, you know, that's kind of left to be interpreted. And one person can say, well, it's easy. It's a yes or no answer. But again, you know, based on whose interpretation of what has been fulfilled. And Morgen touched on, you know, the idea of schools and education. So yeah, we were promised education as part of the treaty, but because of education, there were many tragedies within that component of education. And one of them can be the forced extinguishment of our language. And so that really is a huge and hot topic for Native people across the country right now, the loss of Native languages. And that started with boarding schools. So here's a treaty that says, you know, I guess in tone, okay, Navajo people, this is going to be the agreement. You agree to do these things, and we'll promise these things. And part of it's education. And Navajo people and Navajo leadership have always been proponents of learning, and that's it's actually a part of Navajo general philosophy. There's a component focused on learning. So, but within that learning system that was introduced by the government, that really eradicated central components to our culture across this whole country. And there are many tribes that their languages are extinct now, or there are people who are fluent speakers you can count on one hand. So so there's a lot of interpretation as to what the treaties have and have not accomplished, and it would be based on who you asked. So, you know, that's kind of that's an answer for now within a couple minutes.
I'll add a comment on the whole treaty part, just as kind of a design side and not history side so much. Was that I think, Manny, in particular, you really kind of stressed the importance of the treaty as part of the Bosque story. And we had the 150th kind of in the middle of our process, right? And there was a great show at Navajo Nation Museum, Navajo Nation Museum, that Manny curated about that document. And I went and saw it in Window Rock, and it really, I was impressed with, because I don't think white people understand this, like what a treaty means as proof of sovereignty. And just that part of the story was really a key. I think as a designer, I might have left it out. And in the end, we did this big touchscreen digital interactive that really highlights it. So, again, kind of where is the emphasis in the story, and what do you look over, and what do you kind of dig deep on? I feel like that was a really great contribution from your side as consultant for designer. I would have missed that one, I straight out. So
we have another question from outgoing NCPH president, Greg Smoke. Although this is outside of the specific context of the Bosque Redondo, I'm curious if the story of the many Navajos who escaped the long walk is touched upon in the exhibit. And I'm going to turn that to Aaron and Manny, obviously. And then I want to leave just a couple, we have 4 minutes left. So real brief, and then if Holly and Manny have final thoughts, or other folks have final thoughts.
And and the short answer is it's not really touched upon because there's a lot of aspects of this history. There's not enough space to tell every part of the story. And from a design standpoint, I'm sure Brian and Eldon can speak to this as well, that we try to highlight as much as we can and what is known. But no, that's a good point to make, because a lot of people come to a space like this saying, well, it didn't happen to me. So there's a difficulty in relating to the history.
The commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the signing of the treaty, to answer the question about, the discussion of those who escaped. So absolutely, the commemoration really dredged up a lot of things and topics that had settled. And that's a major topic. A lot of people really have come forward with the conscious understanding of their family's history that they never went to the long walk. So that's a sentiment that I've heard a lot, especially since Eldon talked about, we had an exhibit here at the museum, and a lot of people, that was a major comment that their family did not go on the long walk. So another thing that I heard, and I can't remember who I heard it from, whether it was from Aaron, he's got a plethora of knowledge about the history, the state and federal history of Fort Sumner and the Long Walk, or if I heard it from an oral history of of another Navajo person. But the idea that Navajo people were traveling back and forth between Fort Sumner and Navajo lands, that there was and were people escaping and under secrecy and traveling back and forth between Fort Sumner and Navajo and the Navajo Nation. So, it's like we as Americans and as Native people with colonized minds, we kind of forget about that. We kind of forget about Native people have, thousands and thousands of years of history of living in this continent. And of course we would know how to survive It's not like, oh, go to Fort Sumner and we lose all aptitudes for survival. So, of course, I feel that that's a true statement, that there were either individuals or either just small groups of people that were escaping and traveling back and forth and relaying information and doing things like that. And another thing, a point to make about that, about the Navajos and, other Mescalero, I'm sure that was the same for Mescalero. People were probably escaping and traveling back and forth in between Fort Sumner and their homelands. But, to tell me that 10,000 people came from the Navajo area, which is very vast, and that's all the Navajo people that were in that gigantic land mass. It doesn't make sense. And there's another researcher that is putting a book together. He was putting it together at the time of in 2018, and it's about to say that there were more Navajos that did not go to Fort Sumner. So if you say that 10,000 people were in Fort Sumner, so this is what this guy is telling me verbally. So I have no way to fact check it, but it makes common sense out of this large landmass that there were just as many Navajo people that were in hiding in this vast landscape of ours. So regardless if it's true or not for now, at least this understanding of this point of history for Navajo people, for Mescalero people, and for Americans, it gets our wheels turning, and it makes us think about things that are logical and then things that are moral. So those are all very important, and why this exhibit and museum is important.
Thank you, Manny. We are at time, but Holly, if you wanted to say anything, I think we're gonna stop recording any second now. Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, right.
You don't
No
have to say
pressure.
anything.